Well, good morning, everyone. Good to see so many of you here. Sitting down at the front, I wasn't quite aware how full the auditorium is. My name's Tony Bambridge. I discovered that this morning when I looked at my tag. I'm your chairman for this session. I'm a farmer from Norfolk in England. I'm also involved with Greenvale AP as their non-executive chairman, one of the sponsors, and I'm a Potato Council board member. So our first speaker today, our keynote speech, is from Sir John Beddington, who is our government's chief scientific advisor. And a while ago he raised the concept of the perfect storm, which led to him publishing the Foresight report on global food and farming futures. This report highlighted the need for us to take action now if we are going to feed a growing population in the future. Sir John, as you heard, will speak, and then unfortunately he has to leave us, so he'll take a few questions immediately after his talk. And if we could just have questions rather than statements, that would be great. And then unfortunately he'll have to go, and then we'll go on to our second speaker. Sir John Beddington, we're really honoured to have you here today. We look forward to your speech.
Well, thank you, Chairman, and good morning, everybody. I've been given some tough tasks in my life. You know, normally I'm asked to speak just before the cocktail reception or something like that, and everybody's very impatient. But rarely have I been in the position of actually having to follow an act like that, in which both the beauty of the singing was only matched by the appearance of the singers. So it's a tough act, so I'll do my best. As the Chairman has said, I'm the government, and for those of you from overseas, I should explain what a government chief scientific advisor is. I report directly to the UK Prime Minister, but I'm a civil servant, so I used to report directly to Gordon Brown when he was Prime Minister, and currently I report to David Cameron. What I'm going to talk about today is in part gloomy, in part frightening, and I hope in part optimistic. And so I'll get straight into it because I've got half an hour to cover rather a lot. I think the first thing to say is that there's a lot of uncertainty in the world, but we are looking in key ways, and I'm going to expand on that in a little while. The next 20 years, in many of the important ways, are really already determined. Population increase, I'll go on to that. We know there were, in 2011, for the first time, the world population reached 7 billion, and it's likely to reach 8 billion in just 13 years' time. In 2010, for the first time, the urban population of the world exceeded the rural. That trend is set to continue. And climate change, which the President alluded to in his comments on farming in Russia, is going to happen because the delays in the times in the climate system mean that the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere now will determine our climate anyway for 20 years, irrespective of what the international community does. So I'm going to expand on those ideas now. Let me just take population. As I said, there were 7 billion people in 2011. And in 13 years, there's going to be a further billion. And as you can see from this graph, that increase is going to be determined largely by an increase of 500 million people in Africa and 500 million people in Asia. Largely, the rest of the world is going to be unchanged. And it's important to the thesis to understand how insensitive that prediction is. This upper graph here shows the central line in the top graph shows what's the best bet. What our best demographers in the UN system reckon could well happen. But the upper line is if we don't see a decline in human fertility, and the bottom line is if we actually do see a big response in fertility, because it's female fertility that is actually going to generate those changes. And we know what generates those changes. It's the education of women, it's prosperity, and it's the availability of contraception. But the point I want to make here at the moment is look at down to 2025. There's almost no difference between the graphs. And that's why I make the point that really the next 15 or 20 years are pretty much already determined in terms of population growth. And that really is something quite concerning. If I go to the next slide, I'll talk about urbanization. The proportion of the people living in cities is going to increase, and it's going to increase quite dramatically. As we look out to about 2025, we're going to see an increasing proportion of people living in cities. And to give that some illustration, the extra 500 million people who will be on the planet living in Africa will be in about 1,000 cities the size of Edinburgh. And that is in the next 13 years. So the changes that are going to be occurring in Africa are an increase in population of about 50%. There's 1 billion Africans now. There will be 1.5 billion in 13 years' time. And that additional 500 million people will all be living in cities of about the size of Edinburgh. In Asia, something similar will be happening, except the cities will be larger, and the increase in population is much less as a proportion. Asia is around 4 billion now. It will increase to about 4.5 billion. But the world as a whole will be faced with this enormous challenge of how to deal with that big increase in population, the big increase in urbanization. And then there's a third factor, which is actually a factor of good, in the sense that, to a good extent, the world is getting more prosperous. It's getting more prosperous in the sense in parts of South Asia and South America, and indeed in Africa, there is an increasing prosperity, and more people are entering what might very loosely be called the middle classes. But with that comes a desire, and a proper desire, for increased consumption, better quality agricultural products, more energy, more quality, more livestock, more dairy products, and so on. So that's the projections that are happening. And as I said, the other issue is that climate change is here. The chairman said so, and I think that I find it extraordinary that there are still groups who do not believe that climate change is happening. And let me now just focus on this. I'm sorry, this is a slightly complicated graph, but actually in concept it's very straightforward. The green lines, which show the uncertainty around the change in global temperature, reflect really what would happen if the international community either fails to control greenhouse gas emissions, which would be the upper line, or if it actually succeeds. So these are, if you like, and it's labeled on this slide, scenario uncertainty. There's a natural uncertainty in any modeling, in any scientific assessment of climate change, and there's a fundamental uncertainty because climate is uncertain and weather is uncertain, and that's well known. But again, the point I would make here is the green doesn't really start to become important until we're out another 20 years or so. So to a good extent, and this really is truly important, is that climate change is happening, and it's going to be continuing to happen. And the climate system means that what is up in the atmosphere at the moment will determine our climate for the next 20 or 30 years. Now, people have also often claimed that scientists exaggerate this, that scientists are saying climate change is happening and it's really terrible because that's the way they can get research grants, publish papers in scientific journals, and get bonuses on their salary. So let me take it out of science for a moment and on this graph. And this is a graph that's been compiled by Munich Re, which is one of the largest reinsurance companies in the world. Munich Re, based in Munich, as you probably deduce. Let me look at this. First of all, they looked at the catastrophes worldwide over the 30 years between 1980 and 2010. And the red bars are geophysical events, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes. There's no trend. If you look at the other bars, the green is the meteorological events, the blue is hydrological events, floods or rains, major droughts, and the climatological events are also extreme temperatures, extreme droughts, and extreme forest fires. This is not scientists producing data that may be somehow selective. This is a very hard-bitten business community who believe that climate change is happening, that it's dramatic, and it's continuing to increase. But let's just go slightly more parochial and again focus, because there's a lot of controversy in the USA about, both in political and scientific terms, about whether climate change is happening, and if it is, whether in fact it's determined by human activity. And I would say that the enormous burden of evidence is that it is. Let me just look at Texas. The blue dots and the line that goes through them shows the variation in temperature and rainfall in Texas over the last 100 years. The pink dot was last year. I think you'll see, and I think it's pretty obvious from this graph, that that shows that there is a real difference. And this is just one example, the 3-week earlier extension of potato harvesting in Russia, massive floods in Thailand, major issues in Russia and the Ukraine in 2010, leading to big problems in terms of drought and production of cereals. So those are the sort of things that are happening, and why I say they're happening, they're going to continue to happen. So for food, and to think about the food security issue, we've got a massive challenge. In the next 13 years, we're going to need a lot more food production, but we need to do it on less land. We're going to need it with less water. And unlike the Green Revolution that made a major change and meant that food production worldwide kept up with population increase, we can't actually, this new revolution, this new change in the world food system is going to have to be done using less water, less energy, less fertilizer, and less pesticide. So that's the problem. If you were going to start to deal with a problem like that, it would be okay if we were starting from a good position, but we're not. At the moment, there's around about 1 billion people are in genuine food poverty, i.e. they don't get enough energy to have their own, to have decent physical and mental development. That's about 1 billion people in the world. There's a further 1 billion who suffer from genuine malnutrition, which affects their development. There's a little under 1 billion people who lack access to clean water, and actually, thing quite often neglected, there's something like 1.5 billion people who are without sufficient electricity or energy, and that's going to increase substantially. And this system, our food system, of which the potato industry is a part, is really failing. This is a complicated graph. I'll just take a moment to go through it. The upper line, the blue line, is the number of people in genuine poverty. And the history of world food prices, which was a decline in real terms for about 3 or 4 decades, suddenly reversed in 2007-8, and you got that food price spike. That food price spike had the effect of putting another 100 million people into poverty. The little box inside shows the effect that that had when the food price spike occurred again in 2010-11. That 2010-11 price spike came about because of these massive drought and temperature increases in Russia, some similar but slightly different problems of very, very excessive rainfall in parts of China and parts of South Asia, and drought as well. These are extreme weather events, and they're going to become more and more likely. And the event in 2011 showed a rise in the food price index, and in that period, another 44 million or so people went into extreme poverty. So this is the problem. Now, should we care? The UK is a wealthy country, and I'm saying we, as I'm the UK Chief Scientific Advisor, should we care? Well, this analysis here, which was published last year, relates that food price index to civil riots. Now, as you can see, the number of events, they're showing in brackets the number of people who died, and nobody in the right mind is going to say that the Arab Spring and the consequent suffering that we've seen in North Africa is entirely the result of food prices. But what we can notice is that when food prices are relatively low and that there is less fluctuation, you have had less civil disorder, less problems of riots and so on. And we are looking to a situation that if we fail to address the issue of food security in the context of the urbanization we're observing, we can expect significant breakdown of civil society. There is no doubt, I believe, that that is likely to happen, and it's going to be a problem, and it's going to be a problem that we will have to take seriously as a world community, because we will be looking at the potential for failed states. We will be looking at the potential for human catastrophe at levels that we've not dreamt of before. So these are really difficult and important problems. And we can't think about food without water. And there's a real issue, obviously, in the potato industry, water is completely and utterly fundamental. But agriculture and the use of water worldwide, there's a number of points here, 70% of total global water is used by the agricultural industry. If you divide between developed and developing countries, developing world, about 85% or so is used by agriculture. And we need to be thinking about it, and of course, different types of agriculture, the production of livestock, and high-quality livestock, the production of root crops, they differ in their demand for water. But water is a fundamental problem. And irrigation is the key. And this graph shows, and I know later in the parallel session there'll be many more and better presentations on water problems later on. But I think the issue here is the dependence of the world community on water. And in a sense, it's sort of a trivial thing, but we're not making any more water, certainly not making any more land either. So there is a gap between water supply and what is going to be required. And give or take, and you can see this here, we've got the existing withdrawals in billion cubic meters, round about 4,500. Projection is that we're going to need about 6,900 by 2030. So the 40% shortfall in the availability of water. And how are we going to do that? Now, there are some cause for hope. In recent studies, for example, show major subsurface water reserves, some work by the British Geological Survey in Africa. There's potential to do it. But we've got to be very careful here, because the exploitation of underground water is something that can be really messed up. To give you an idea, some of the water that is being used for irrigation worldwide, particularly northwest India, but also in parts of the USA, is using water that is several hundred years old, sometimes as much as 1,000 years old. So the sustainability, if we're going to get some hope of water harvesting from the subsurface, from aquifers, is going to be a real challenge to try to get it right. If we don't, we'll see yet more problems. So the chairman this morning alluded to a report I commissioned on the future of food and farming. That reported last year, just over a year ago. It came out in February 2011. And I posed there were five key challenges, and some of these I'm going to go through in the context of your own industry. There's the balancing of future demand and supply, and so on. I'm assuming you can read. I'm going to take some of these. This has had a lot of influence, I'm glad to say, both in the UK and internationally. But during last year, after that report came out, I was asked to chair an international commission, 13 members, all experts in their own right, looking on sustainable agriculture and climate change, which we see it. And there's a plethora of reports. We've been out both in English and in French and Spanish and so on. And the aim of this commission was to try to identify some of the things that are going to be needed if we are going to address the sustainable agriculture issue in climate change. And 7 key recommendations. I won't read them out. You can all read. And anyway, this is the sort of thing that you can go to and read at length. But there were 7 basic recommendations. And I think it's best to illustrate it in this way. And this is a cartoon. Where are we now? Well, at the moment, we've got a real problem with climate change. It's happening now. We aren't feeding enough people. So how are we going to actually get to a situation where enough people are fed and climate change is kept to something that can be manageable? And the problem here is the black dot shows where we are at the moment, and the open dot, the little empty circle to the right, is our current projection of current trends of where we're going to be. So we're currently in a situation where we're not producing enough food, and global warming is definitely happening. We're projected to move to a situation which is worse in both senses. More substantial global warming and still not enough food. Where we want to be is into a safe space. Somewhere where we produce enough food and we keep global warming to something that is manageable. But the problem is this, is that agriculture uses greenhouse gases. So if we move to a situation where increasing greenhouse gases where agriculture continued, we would see an increase in greenhouse gas production so that it is really going to be difficult. So business as usual in the agricultural community to expand production, to actually meet the requirements of a burgeoning human population and burgeoning demand and if we do it in the current ways, they're going to exacerbate climate change. So we have a real problem there. And the idea is that we need something like a climate-smart agriculture, an agriculture that operates on marginal land, an agriculture that operates with less fossil fuels and produces more product for less greenhouse gas emissions. And that really is the recommendation of the Commission, with lots of detail around it. But this meeting is about potatoes. Now, as Chief Scientific Advisor, I have a completely mad brief. Some people say it's insane, because I'm responsible for all science and engineering in the United Kingdom. Is that all you may reasonably quote? What it means is that whenever I'm talking, I'm usually talking to people who know a lot more about the subject than I do. If I say that I am less alarmed to be talking to the World Potato Congress than I was when I was talking to a group of laser physicists who were talking about nuclear fusion last week, this is not to put down the intellectual quality potato, just to see I'm more in my comfort zone than I was with them. So we put together, Joanna, my private secretary, put together a little bit of a line about potatoes, which is in the bottom. Some of the points that are made, I'm sure others in the conference will do. I was particularly delighted that the first French fries were invented in 1801, but actually in Edinburgh we call them chips. The potato crisp was invented about 40 years later. And then there was a big gap in scientific development, as far as I can see, till the first potato was grown in space in some 140-odd years later. So those are the sort of issues. But actually, being more serious, the potato genome was published in Nature last year. Modern genomics has enormous potential for actually moving into this climate-smart agriculture. Because if we were thinking about this food security problem in the 20th century, we'd make more land available. We'd cut down forests, we'd plow up perennial grassland. We would do that and we would have it, but we don't have that opportunity. The graph shows the amount of land that is inarable, and as you can see, there's obviously some variation, but it's flattening. So we need an agriculture that increases, which is increased intensification. We need sustainable intensification. In potatoes, again, to do it, this is something that seems to me to afford the most enormous potential. Global food potato cultivation is dramatic. The figures which we got from the FAO statistics, I'm sure Slight bewailing spurious accuracy. I'm not entirely sure that the Chinese production was actually measured to an individual ton, but these give a fairly good indication of the global food crop, exceeding a massive contribution to human wealth. And actually, some of the issues are looking really quite good in the sense that yields are continuing to increase. There's a better, yields are going up. The amount of land that's been used has actually been declining somewhat, but yield has been increasing. It's been increasing over the last 50 years or so. And that, hopefully, that will increase, and I believe that we have a real potential to do it. Because we've got a massive problem. I've talked about climate change. I said it's happening. And if we fail to do something about it, we're going to be looking not at a world which will be comfy, but a world in which it will be extraordinarily uncomfy. This is some work that was done by the UK Hadley Centre, and it makes 2 points which I'll make here. One is that this is a 4-degree world. This is a world which, if there is no intervention by the international community over the next 10 years to cut back on greenhouse gas emissions, this is a world we're likely to reach. In the worst scenario, we could be reaching it by about 2070. In the best scenario, we could be reaching it in 2100 or so. But also there will be a variation, and the variation is that 4-degree world is an average of the oceans and the land masses, and it will differ from parts of the world. And the worst area, so the best is in the Arctic. A 4-degree average world is likely, at the very best, to mean an 8-degree increase in the Arctic, with the consequent melting of sea ice, the consequent melting of the tundra, the rotting of vegetation and the production of methane. And this is a sort of pattern. I don't have time to go into it in detail, but this is the thing that we really have got to be avoiding at all cost, because that climate will affect the community throughout the world in a way. And it's already happening. For example, many of you will know much more about this. The President spoke about the extended growing life in Russia. But in the Andes, land is now being cultivated about 150 meters higher than they were 30 years ago. And we need to be thinking about how we adapt to climate change. And there's a changing geography. In Southeast Asia, most potatoes are produced on deltas. They're highly fertile, but they're lower-lying areas, and they're going to be potentially vulnerable to sea surges and salination, let alone the urbanization, which is also occurring in the deltas. So the changing geography is going to be one of the things as climate affects it over the next 10, 20, or 30 years. And in the UK, we're not immune from that. Recent studies in the UK looking at the climate change risk indicate that all of our major river basins are going to be in deficit by the 2020s, so 10 or 12 years away. We're going to be in deficit in all our major river basins. We have real issues to deal with, obviously, in terms of where is available and what is suitable land. And we're going to be needing, and there will be problems of water, and how we manage that is a thing for the next few years, because these decisions have got to be taken. Now, I do know sweet potatoes are not part of your conference, but I did want to extend it a little bit. And we need to be thinking about hunger. And for example, sweet potatoes, and forgive me bringing in an alien species into the discussions, but real potential here for improving nutrition and ending hunger using sweet potatoes. And the other one that I want to talk about is waste and pest disease. About 40% of the potato crop is actually lost due to pest and disease. And climate change is expected to significantly increase this problem in the USA, in the UK, and changes in precipitation intensity, which actually the President spoke about, have real potential to increase. The climate models indicate it's more and more likely that there will be, whatever the change in average rainfall, there will be an increase in intensity. And that's likely to damage crops and deal with, and actually generate, for example, blight. There were smart things to do, understanding taxonomy. This particular one, which many of you know the example much better than I would, but new varieties moving into new areas can actually significantly affect it. So the preservation of the biodiversity of potatoes is enormously important because it has the potential to actually really help in addressing climate change. And science and technology can also help. This is some work from the Sainsbury Laboratory in the east of England, showing the effect that late blight can have. The figures be familiar for many of you of the devastating effect blight can have. The inset picture shows some genetically modified potato plants which have actually had a gene which is resistant to blight inserted in them, and the bottom one is the non-genetically intruded. It is quite clear this is something that can help, and there is a controversy within the United Kingdom and Europe about the use of GM crops, and my own position is completely clear. GM crops should be used when they can solve a problem, subject, of course, to proper tests on the possible effects on human health and environment. And the recent demonstration yesterday, gladly relatively small in Rothamsted, where wheat was being grown, which actually produces an aphid pheromone, which means that aphids move away from the plant. That is going to be one that is exciting. Very sad that a group of people felt they should disrupt it. I'm glad to say they didn't do so. So finally, also back to sweet potatoes, again, real potential, again, and I believe this is also true for certain varieties of proper potatoes, is the potential for bioethanol production. Rather better. This is some examples showing that actually came from work in Maryland and Alabama, showing that we can use sweet potatoes on marginal land and produce biofuels. So finally, what are the next steps? Next steps are going to occur in my world at the international level. We have a conference of the G20 this month now, in Mexico, which is looking at smallholder agriculture. There's the big conference in Rio later on in June, where we are going to be thinking about sustainable development goals. The next meeting of the Conference of the Parties on Climate Change is occurring in Qatar in November. These are the challenge at the international agenda, which political leaders and advisors like myself have got to up the ante and make certain decisions are taken, money is made available. We need technological innovation. We need smart things being done by smart scientists who are funded to do it. And we also need to be thinking about the social events. We need to be thinking about the social context. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Sir John. I think you've really set the scene. Now, we can take just a few questions. So there are some roving microphones, and we would really like you to ask the question in the microphone. There's a gentleman with glasses about 6 rows up, all down here. So can someone get a microphone to that gentleman, please? That's it. Get Gary down. That's it. Excellent. It'd be great if you could just state your name, sir.
Yeah, my name's Guy Faulkner, World Potato Markets. Thank you, Professor Beddington. There's one thing that I don't understand. In one of your slides, you said that world precipitation is falling, but if the climate is if the temperatures are rising, the climate's getting warmer, surely more water is evaporated from the oceans, and you would expect rainfall to increase in the future. I don't understand that point.
No, I'm sorry, you should have made it more clear. Rainfall overall will definitely increase for the reasons you say. It's simple physics. In certain areas, it may actually decrease, but even in areas where it's going to decrease, the intensity of rainfall will actually increase. So sorry about that. I'll make certain the slide is more clear about it next time. But you're quite right.
Okay, another question just in front. Gary, yes, gentlemen. If you could say your name, sir, as well, please.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Anton Haverkort from Wageningen University, the Netherlands. I'm referring to a review by your compatriot, Jaggert from Harpenden et al. They reviewed some 15 or 20 different CO2 trials where they increased the CO2 concentration from 380 to 550 parts per million. 550 parts per million will be the lowest estimate of CO2 concentration by 2050. They compared some 7 or 8 different crops like rice, sugarcane and so on, and potato also. The C4 crops, like sorghum and maize, are not influenced by a higher CO2 concentration. Wheat had about a 7% higher yield. Potato, and I won't go into the details of the physiology of it, potato at least a 30% yield increase only due to the increase of CO2 going from 380 to 550. In your view, does it mean that research priorities or other things should maybe shift into this kind of a favorable crop when it comes to CO2 increase?
Yeah, you're quite right. CO2 increases will have positive effects on certain crops. I think the big problem I have are twofold. Is that it's not just production and the effect of CO2, it's that climate change will have an effect on the distribution of pests and diseases. It will also have an effect on the availability of water. And albeit we might get increases in some crops on the basis of a CO2 increase, that is going to be conditional on essentially a benign pest and disease environment and a benign environment for the availability of water. And that is not, by no means can that be guaranteed. But you're quite right, there are, and I think in a sense the burden of your question is saying, should we not be researching these problems? The answer to that is absolutely unequivocally yes. I think that the last 30 or 40 years, the world community has really got it wrong. They've been looking at there was a decline in real food prices for 30 or 40 years or so, only reversed in 2007-8, and investment in agricultural research declined substantially. And that has now been reversed. But if we recognize that the innovations in agriculture typically will take up to almost 10 years before they move from the laboratory to the farm, then we really have got to be making certain that our work is being done urgently and now, and thinking about how we can quickly move it on to help farmers.
Right. Is there any more questions?
There's a chance.
Yes, we'll take that one there, and then there's one down the front here, which will be the final question. This lady down here.
Finlay Dale from James Hutton Institute. Fascinating talk, thank you very much. Just to highlight one area you didn't mention, which is really being affected by climate change, and your last comments with respect to South America, is the potential loss of genetic resources.
Yeah. You're quite right. I was having various signs showing 5 minutes, 3 minutes, minus 4 minutes as I was completing my speech. So I didn't want to have a chance to do it. But actually, genetic resources are enormously important. We have the potential to preserve some of these. Potato is one classic example in South America. It's the place where we have got to be very, very careful about preserving genetic resources. But it applies to wheat, it applies to grasses, it applies to livestock. This is an enormous resource. I think GM technology will help, but it's no means the basic answer. And if one can actually be using natural genetic resources to actually assist in improving breeds, this has clearly got to be an important thing to do. So I agree completely with your comment. Time is the problem.
Fine, thank you. Madam, final question.
Thank you. Sir Beddington, thank you for that talk. I'm Pamela Anderson, the Director General of the International Potato Center. Politically, what do you see coming out of Rio Plus 20? What are the Sustainable Development Goals going to move us towards, and how will it relate to the Millennium Development Goals?
Well, normally when I get questions like that, I say, well, I'm the Chief Scientific Advisor, not the Chief Political Advisor. But I think I'm reasonably optimistic about the Rio, but it's a long way away, I think, from getting real progress. And I think that I just see this as ongoing. I think the Rio Plus 20 will have some limited developments. The idea of sustainable development goals may actually come on, but it is very difficult with conferences of several hundred nation states to reach some degree of consensus. It's early days, I should be there, I should be hopeful, and I shall be trying to see how we can take this forward. But I think that we do have to recognize this is ongoing, that one particular conference will not change the world. but that just happens to be the next one. The next one in Qatar in November. We had the meeting in Durban in which we took the proposal to Durban that significant funding that has been made available for sustainable forestry to address climate change needs to be actually moved into the agricultural sector, so to assist climate smart agriculture. That did not reach unanimous agreement in Durban, but the idea is that this will be examined in the interim and will be discussed again in Qatar. I think there will be a lot of work to do over the years, and I'm hopeful that Rio will make some progress, but it's not going to solve the problem completely. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Sir John Beddington. Sir John, you've really set the scene for us for this conference, the scene of the global food and farming challenges before us. Clearly, we have to produce more and impact less, and you set the challenge that we need to have a climate-smart agriculture. Sir, I know you have to leave us, but we'll stay and sort that little problem over the next 2 days in our own small way. Thank you very much indeed.